I love you, Poland! Nice, of course.
Witam Państwa. Ja miałam tak naprawdę zadawać pytania, które Państwo mają do Jeremiego, ale z tego co ja wiem, nikt żadnego jeszcze nie zadał. Proszę się nie załamywać, to nie jest Wasza ostatnia szansa. Ja mam tutaj przygotowane kilka, ale jeżeli w trakcie okaże się, że Państwo też by chcieli Jeremiego o coś dopytać, bardzo proszę o zwrócenie uwagi hostes, które będą chodziły po sali z mikrofonami, bo moim celem jest włączyć Państwa w dyskusję. And now I'm going to switch to English. I just told everybody that they should be asking you questions, not me. But since nobody's been brave enough to ask the first one, I'm going to start by going through this morning's talk that you gave and asking for specifics. One of the things you talked about was user experience, and that it's more important than the bullet points that used to be a way of communicating about new brands. User experience is an internet developer's phrase. So I wanted to ask you, how has internet changed the way we think about marketing?
Well, I think that's a really cool question. I think that I like to look at what's happened in, let's say, retail. If you rewound back to the 1990s, the late 90s, it used to be that you went to a store to buy widgets. And these stores were big gray boxes, and that's kind of what the experience was. I just go buy stuff. And then e-commerce started coming along, and all of a sudden brands started getting distracted about what's their e-commerce site. We started using the word, brick and mortar, like as if that was something from before. But it distracted us from making our store experience better. Then fast forward a little bit more, and you started having this marketing change where it was about experience, like that Harley-Davidson example that I gave. All of this kept meaning we kept avoiding what happened in the stores. Then finally social media comes along, and now people are powerful. Now as a marketer, I'm not even worried about what happens to my product. I'm worried about what happens with each person that comes in my store. So suddenly there's this shift back, and we're realizing how powerful and important the consumer is. In retail, as an example, it's become theatrical. It's become about the experience. And I'll say that maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we thought about social media in terms of, let's see how many followers we can get on Facebook or Twitter. But now it's something more. It's how do you get people to talk about your brand? So one of the examples that we followed this year was the idea of retail as entertainment. And an example would be IKEA. So IKEA ended up doing sleepover parties, which you may have seen, where for the 150 people that went to an IKEA on that particular day, they got to have a sleepover party and watch movies and have spa treatments and get manicures and pedicures. That's not IKEA's work for the 150 people. They're doing that for the fact that those 150 people share everything online, who share it to their friends, and soon that's a global spectacle. So you have this weird shift now where the person is so powerful that as your consumer, that marketing-wise, you're just trying to think of ways to surprise and delight them to get them to share.
Well, the internet has also changed the way that we track trends. Trends used to be something that you found out about from magazines, from colorful magazines. And from what I remember from our past conversation, magazines used to feed your inspiration as well. How has tracking trends changed from the days when you used to look for trends in magazines to using the internet now?
Sure. Well, you're kind of walking in on something, and I give you guys a little bit of a secret. I didn't have it in my presentation today, but it's a pretty tough time for me because 2 weeks ago, I was giving the eulogy for my father who passed away from a heart attack. But in doing that, I had a lot of people talk to me about, making a celebration of him. And I'd actually been interviewing him for my last book because I realized what a huge role he's played in everything that I've ever done. And when I rewind and think about my life growing up, what would happen is that he was a serial entrepreneur, charismatic guy, and every week we would go through every magazine we could possibly buy, about 100 magazines a month or more. And as we'd flip through the magazines, he'd say, what about this idea? Do you like this idea or this idea? Would this work? No, Dad, maybe this would work. And we would talk about each business concept, regardless of what market it was in. Then on the weekend, we would go and get scrap parts and spare materials, and we would just prototype things that could be like a rocket-powered skateboard or whatever it might be. And so what I realized when I look back at that is he taught me the importance in business of scouring the world and doing the research to push yourself to look for ideas, but then also to test those ideas and prototype and try new things. So when I look at what I've done with Trend Hunter, well, I've really just extended the same thing that he's done. I've realized that with the internet, you can bring people together to scour for ideas, and that it's even easier than ever to prototype, because now you can use Kickstarter and 3D printing and all sorts of neat ways to actually try and test out your theories.
Well, one of the things that your website does is use crowdfunding and crowd filtering. How exactly does that work?
Well, it used to be that when you wanted to know what the trends were, you would ask some bright guru and they would tell you. But we believe in the power of the people. So the way Trend Hunter works is that anyone around the world, whether you're from Poland or South America, can sign up, and people submit cool innovations. And maybe it's, in Warsaw we saw an upside-down fashion boutique where they recreated everything upside down. So for example, if you're in Warsaw and you saw that, you could take a picture, you could write it up, and then we share it with the world. That's the crowdsourcing. So the cool way we operate is there's about 120,000 people hunting for ideas, but then we use our audience as if it was a giant focus group. And every month we have almost 50 million views come through our site, and we look at what they're looking for. What are the patterns that seem to be bubbling up? And then we'll work with brands to actually filter through that noise. And for companies like Crayola or Intel or Kellogg's, we try and help them use that as a giant focus group to find new ideas.
How can businesses use this idea of crowd filtering and crowdsourcing?
Well, I think the interesting takeaway we started with today is that inspiration is so ubiquitous now that it's become overwhelming and distracting. And it's easy then to think you already know what's happening in your market and to just innovate without looking outside. So I think what you need to push yourself to do is yourself or your organization spend time to actually be finding the places online that work best, as an example, to be trying to find inspiration to constantly fuel your teams. And at Trend Hunter, I'm a little biased because that's our purpose. That's what we're trying to do. And almost all of Trend Hunter is free, so you're welcome to use it. But I think that the idea is that you're not just relying on one person's gut instinct, because in a time period of change, you need to realize that you're losing touch with, let's say, what a millennial might think. And the only way to know that is to really study what's happening online.
In Silicon Valley, I believe that the method they're using to test new ideas is actually to go on Kickstarter and similar crowdfunding sites to see if they can raise money for the idea. Yeah. So this seems like a similar concept.
Yeah, and one of my favorite trends is the term that we call instant entrepreneurship, which is the idea that it's never been easier than ever to be an entrepreneur trying an idea, or as a company to launch a new product or concept. And it's exactly what you're talking about, because you could go and you could have a new website designed tomorrow. You could outsource that to India. You could go to 99designs.com and have people compete to make your logo. You could use Fiverr, and for $5 you could get that turned into business cards. Then you could go on Kickstarter and sell a product before you've ever even made it. And then you can even make your prototypes with 3D printers, like the MakerBot that you see on the way into this conference. So I think it's interesting now that you can actually prototype and try ideas without even doing them. One of my friends is a guy named Jake Bronstein. And he had a website called Zoomdoggle, and it's just about fun for him. He just likes experimenting and doing fun things. And he started looking at American apparel and seeing all of their authentic sort of made locally clothing. But for those that know American apparel, they also push the brand. They're very risque with their photography. They're under a lot of criticism for overly sexualizing their photos. And he thought, couldn't I do a wholesome thing like this? Couldn't there be a brand that was about locally made clothing, but not with the risque stuff? So he just found a place where he could get boxer shorts made in America, close to where he was. And then he decided to put it up on Kickstarter, and he marketed it as if it was already a product ready to go. His goal was $30,000 worth of boxer shorts, but he sold $350,000 of boxer shorts. Now he had a company. It was called Flint & Tinder. He made the website. He figured out how to make that many boxer shorts. And then he made his next Kickstarter, which was hoodies. And again, he hadn't made hoodies, like jogging suit hoodies, and he sold more than $1 million worth. So this proved to him, this guy who had no company, no marketing budget, that by testing his idea, he only needed to find out if it would be possible to make it, and as soon as he knew that, he could go out and test. And the next thing you know, now he's got a company.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Sir, microphone, please.
Jeremy, thank you for your presentation. I'm really energized by the ideas and the thing that the ocean is blue. A question. Not any spotted idea is a trend, yeah? So, a conservative country, And do you have, or I would like to listen your opinion about how you, or could you be sure that you are on a trend or an elusive idea? Is it only the failure or success? It would be interesting to have the checkpoints.
Sure, so I'll give you two answers to that. The first one is that when we talk about the word trend, it's a word that's kind of been ruined over the last 10 years because people use the word trend to refer to everything from what is trending on Twitter, which is whatever Justin Bieber did last, all the way up to the mega trends like the rise of female purchasing power, China, eco, social media. So you're actually looking for the sweet spot in the middle. And it's actually what I've been writing my next book on because I think that there's not enough knowledge about what it really takes to prove something that might work. What I believe you need is not an individual example, but a cluster. You need to find examples of where you can see 5 or 10 unique ideas that are similar that are taking off. But finding those clusters, it's important because you don't want to have the same idea as your competitors. So you specifically don't want to go after the big trend that you know is correct. And yet you don't want to go after the little things. So this is where I get to the second part of my answer, which is that it used to be in business that you needed to pick a trend and be certain because you were going to make one big product every 1 or 2 years. And that's the pace of business. But now it's more about trying to make a business that can adapt. And so you're actually not necessarily needing to bet on one thing. It's better to have a whole bunch of bets. And I'll give you an example that is in fashion. In fashion, there's brands like The Gap and Victoria's Secret, which are considered and we work with some of these, and they're very forward-looking, and they plan what's going to happen 12 months in advance. And that's the difference in time between when someone draws an outfit and when it ends up in the store. But Zara, which you see in this mall, at Zara, they don't make big bets. They don't try and figure out what the next trend is. They don't even spend on advertising because they don't want to be wrong with one of their bets. But here's the better part. Instead of making a company that predicts 12 months out, they've done everything they can to make a company that sees all the little tiny trends and just moves really fast with lots of bets so that it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. And instead of taking 1 year, they only take 14 days to make a product. So a designer will sit in a runway, they'll sketch out an example of a red dress with a collar. And within 14 days, that little dress is in 2,000 stores around the world. But they only send 5 sizes of each dress. Now, if you're a young woman and you're in Zara and you see a dress, you know that if you like it, you better buy it today, because that's the last time you can ever buy it. But what's interesting is that the storekeepers will come up to you in Zara and they'll say, hey, do you like that dress? And you think they're just a storekeeper. So you might say, no, I don't. Why don't you like that dress? Well, it has a collar. I don't want a dress with a collar. Okay. At the end of the day, they go and they take all that information and they put it into their computer, and it goes back to head office as market research. And the designers who only made the dress 2 weeks ago see that around the world, nobody wants a collar. So they make a new dress without a collar, and that's their new bet. Now, if we compare the difference between Zara and, let's say, any big fashion brand like The Gap relies on a couple creative people to make really big bets that hopefully will still be good in 2 years from now or a year. But Zara has made a machine that constantly adapts. It makes lots of little bets. And if you step back and you think of our time of chaos and change, I think we all know which company we would bet on 5 years from now. The hungry hunter that just keeps on adapting and adapting. So the sort of long-winded answer I give you there, I would just summarize by saying, yes, you want to be a little bit more certain in your trends than just picking a fad like what Justin Bieber did, but ultimately you also don't want the things that everybody knows that's certain. Instead, you want to look for the little opportunities, the clusters of ideas, and build a company that can test more than one idea at once. That's the longest answer I've ever given to one question, but hopefully that helps. All right, sounds good. So how do you get a small or medium company to open up to the idea of integrating trends? Is that about correct? Okay. So I'll kind of answer that in two ways, because there's this whole idea about big companies versus small companies. And my thought is that if you're big, you need to act small and build all the ways to be agile. And if you're small, you need to try and act big. And as you think about how to make a company that can adapt, the worry that I have when it comes to trends is that people start relying on gut instinct too much. And in a small and medium company, often you're successful because the CEO or the first entrepreneur was creative and they had a flair and they had a great idea that worked, but you don't know that that's going to sustain. So if you're in one of those small to medium companies, I would really start trying to build up the, worry about the chaos that's out there, create a sense of urgency on how this company needs to adapt, using stories like BlackBerry, Kodak, Smith, Corona, and try and get that pressure to realize that you need to be methodical about always hunting for ideas. And basically, it's the assumption that the next big idea isn't going to come from the CEO or the gut instinct of the senior leaders, but you want to build a company where everybody is some level of scouring for new ideas. And the only other note I would tie that to is earlier we talked about the hunter versus the farmer. So this idea that we have 10,000 years of evolution as farmers who want to repeat the same decision as before. So whether you're in a small company or a big company, you need to realize the risk of success and how that makes you complacent, and then think about ways to be hungry and insatiably hunting for new ideas, each month, each week, whatever feels right.
But when we're talking about new trends, from my knowledge, new trends are very attractive to a very specific group of people. They are the trend setters or the early adapters. Is there a risk that you, as a company, can jump on a trend too early before it breaks so that you're actually not hitting the sweet spot of when it goes into becoming popular enough to sustain your product?
So I'd say there's absolutely that risk, especially if you look historically. And this could have even been an issue with Kodak, where you had the digital camera, but it was still a little early because it was expensive. But part of marketing is about trying to make something insatiable to a specific group of people, irresistible to them. And it doesn't mean it has to be the early adopters. You just need a group of people that really likes what it is that you're doing. So yes, if you find that you're too ahead of the curve, maybe there's a risk there. But I think that this concept of making something irresistible is not always about the most expensive technology, and it's not always about the most risque new approach to something. But more simply, what you're trying to do is make something that people love. And if you were an entrepreneur starting a tiny little company, and you could find a group of people that finds your product irresistible, the advantage you have is you're working with this small group that might be too small for the big competitors to even worry about. And what ends up happening is that if you look historically at all the cases where one company topples another, they almost always follow the same pattern. So you start off, and in stage one, you're able to make a little group of people really, really happy with what it is that you do. But the big guys, they don't even worry about it because you're too small and you're irrelevant. In stage two, you start becoming a bit more relevant. You start stealing some of the less valuable customers from the big guy. But they're like, well, you know what? Those are the less valuable customers. Who cares? But now you have this maverick little brand that's irresistible now to not just one group, but maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 different groups of people. And that's where stage three happens, which not everybody sees coming, which is that this growing company either gets acquired or taken out or makes a partnership with one of the competitors in an industry, and it topples everybody else. And so you're seeing that a lot, especially in technology, but there's a number of different fields where I think that your growing plan can literally be finding different pockets of people, just being great for them,